Hello there everyone. Today I wanted to go through the books that I ended up reading for Book Riot's Read Harder Challenge. I created this whole presentation for you guys. So what I'm going to go through here are the books that I picked for each challenge, but I'm going to describe it in a word, and then I'm going to tell you if it pushed me out of my comfort zone or was I already planning to read this book and it kind of just fit into the challenge. And then the third thing that I'll ask myself was, is this a first whatever for me? So the first challenge was to read a horror book, and I read this horror manga titled Uzumaki by Junji Ito. Describe it in a word, I would say gross. The stuff depicted in this book is not for me and made me realize I should continue reading psychological kind of reads more than like straight up horror because it was too much for me at times. So did it push me? It definitely pushed me. I would not have read this book if I didn't have to read a horror book. Horror is not a genre that I ever really see myself in, and I never really think about reading horror except like reading Stephen King horror books. The second challenge was to read a nonfiction book about science, and I read Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta. I loved this book. It was so important, so great. So the word that I would choose is definitely important. Did it push me or was I already going to read this? I was definitely already going to read this, and it just fit perfectly here in the science category because they talk a lot about the science of genes and Henrietta Lacks's cells. Was it a first for me? Yes, it's the first book that I ever really read that had to do with like biology, and it's definitely a first for me to hear this story, which was very, very impactful for me. The challenge was to read a collection of essays, and I read Holidays on Ice by David Sedaris. I ended up thinking this was just okay. Some of the stories were a lot better than the others. If I could describe this in a word, I would say it is vulgar, I guess is the word I would say. It has a kind of humor that is not going to be received well by everybody. I'd never read anything by David Sedaris, so it was definitely a first for me when it comes to reading David Sedaris. The next challenge was to read a book out loud to someone else. I didn't really rate this one because it's only like 60 pages and it's a kid's book, and I read it to my brothers, but I read to them I Wish That I Had Dug Feet. I'd never read this one actually before, and it was really funny. So in a word, I would describe it as funny. Did it push me or was I already going to read it? I was not going to read it, and it pushed me to read it because my brother Anthony was like, can you read this to me? The next challenge was to read a middle grade novel. This one I would describe in a word as absurd is a good word, but I mean absurd in like the best way. Did it push me or was I already going to read this? I was definitely going to read this already. I had a lot of books that I could fit into this challenge actually because I read quite a bit of middle grade and children's literature. So this one, I just thought I should put this one since it's such an iconic series and the first in the series, which I started this year. So was it a first for me? Yes, my first time ever reading a series of unfortunate events. The next challenge was to read a biography. I read Notorious RBG, and I really, really enjoyed this book. If I could describe it in a word, it would be inspiring. Did it push me or was I already going to read this? I was already going to read this because I had heard about it throughout the internet and on other platforms that I watch for book recommendations. Was it a first for me? It was the first time I read anything about Supreme Court justices, like their history, their background, their lives, and the first I ever read about Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself too. The next challenge was to read a dystopian or post-apocalyptic novel. I read the first 3 Sweet Tooth volumes by Jeff Lemire, and I am really enjoying this series. It has to do with hybrids, which I've never read of, like animal hybrids, so that's something completely different. In a word, I would describe this as hopeless. So I say hopeless because it is a post-apocalyptic kind of story, but a series that I really do enjoy. I don't read a lot of dystopian or post-apocalyptic books. I think the last one I read was Station 11. The next challenge was to read a book originally published in the decade you were born, so I was born in the 90s, and I read The Giver for the first time. I really, really was like, why did I take so long to read this book? And I think the word I would select for it is iconic. Did it push me or was I already going to read this? It didn't necessarily push me. What pushed me was a readathon that I did where I was supposed to read a book published, I think before I was born was the whole challenge for it. The next challenge was to listen to an Audie Award winner, and I read Yes Please by Amy Poehler. I have talked lots about how this book has been the most happy I have felt reading this year, and the word that I would use would be smile is what I would use, because my lips were literally like ear to ear as I was reading this book. I was so happy. Did it push me or was I already going to read this? This one definitely pushed me. Like I think I would have read this sooner or later, but I think I probably wouldn't have read it this year, so it definitely pushed me to do that this year. Next challenge was to read a book over 500 pages long, and I read Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. I also read the last Harry Potter book. And I'm getting through my third 500 plus page book right now, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Describe it in a word: finally. I think I would say the word finally just because it took me so long to get to the 6th book. I am so lucky that I had not been spoiled for like anything that had to do with this book. I was sort of spoiled for book 7, but I didn't know what happened in book 6. So my reactions were literally the reactions I would have had if I had read it along with like everybody else in the world when it first came out. Did it push me, or was I already going to read it? I was definitely already going to read it. It was one of my goals for the year. It was the first time I finished the Harry Potter series. That was a big first for me. The next challenge was to read a book under 100 pages. For this one, I read The Strange Library. In a word, I would describe it as surreal for sure. Did it push me, or was I already going to read it? This one I kind of stumbled upon on the library. Was it a first for me? My first Murakami. Definitely going to read more Murakami like next year. The next challenge was to read a book by or about someone who identifies as transgender. I read George by Alex Gino, and I really enjoyed it. I thought the messages that are described here and the very realistic way that they are described are what made this book so special for me, because it really felt like something very true to life. It shows you the importance of people of the community writing books about their community and own voices. Alex Gino is genderqueer, so in a word I would describe it as thoughtful. Did it push me, or was I already going to read it? I was already going to read it for the Diversathon, and was it a first for me? It was the first time I read a book about a transgender character. Definitely something that I need to work on in the new year, as well as reading under the LGBTQ umbrella at large. The next challenge was to read a book set in the Middle East, and I read Dare to Disappoint by Özge Samanci. In a word, I would describe this book as different just because of the way it is put together. It uses mixed media. It looked very sleek, and it just looked like a different kind of graphic memoir than I was used to. I also stumbled upon this one at the library. I was just browsing the graphic novel section, and I just picked this one up. This was the first time I read anything about Turkey, and probably the first thing I read about the Middle East in a long time. The next challenge was to read a book by an author from Southeast Asia, and I read The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai. In a word, I would describe it as masterpiece, because I could definitely see probably how long it took for Sunny Liu to think of all of this, and then probably years that it took him to put it all together. It's a very big graphic novel and goes through so much history too. Was it a first for me? The first Southeast Asian author I've read probably in a long time. It made me realize too that I read a lot of people of color, but I don't read a lot of Asian authors. This is something that I really want to work on in 2017. The next challenge was to read a historical fiction book set before 1900, and I am currently reading Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. In a word, I would describe this as complex, just because the characters are extremely complex. The voice narration, multiple narrators aspect of it makes it really complex. It's messing with my mind, pretty much. Was it a first for me? It was a first in that I don't think I've read a book set in London in this time period in a long time. I want to read more from London during this time period. This is set in 1862. The next challenge was to read the first book in a series by a person of color, and I read all 3 of the March trilogy books. Probably the best thing I read this year. My one word that I decided was life-changing. It was the first time I've seen this kind of history done in an art graphic novel form. The next challenge was to read a non-superhero comic that debuted in the last 3 years. This one I was kind of like, what am I going to pick for this? But Lucky Penny fit perfectly in this one. It's just like a cute comic. That's the word I would use to describe it. My one word is cute. If you're just like in a light mood, this is a book that would be good for that. The next challenge was to read a book that was adapted into a movie and then to watch the movie. I finally got around to finishing Wild by Cheryl Strayed, and in a word I would describe this as emotional. For this challenge it did push me to read this book. Just because I had tried reading it before and put it down, this time I did it on audiobook, and I thought that was a much better way for me to to take in this story. Then I watched the movie, and I also really enjoyed the movie. I thought both are really well done. The next challenge was to read a nonfiction book dealing with feminist themes. For this one, I read Missoula by Jon Krakauer. This one, my word was murky. It just showed me how murky it is to deal with rape on a college campus. The butting of heads between the university and the police that is in that region, and just the way they view rape in very different ways, and how the protocols of how to deal with a rape accusation and investigation. I was already going to read this just because I'd heard so much about it from Twitter. Was it a first for me? This was actually my first Krakauer. I've read 3 Krakauer this year. The next challenge was to read a book about religion, and I read Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. I loved this book. The word that I chose for it was relatable. Did it push me, or was I already going to read it? This one, it did push me. I didn't know what to pick for a book about religion, and then I thought, hey, Judy Blume's written pretty much a book about every issue that affects teenage girls or young girls. The next challenge was to read a book about politics, and I read America Again, Rebecoming the Greatness We Never Weren't by Stephen Colbert. This was published in 2012, so it felt a little dated. There's a lot of Mitt Romney kind of stuff in here that was just like, we're not even in the same reality anymore. I read this during the summer, and I think the more I think about it after this election cycle we just had, the more I value it. If you read this title, it literally sounds like Make America Great Again. My word for it is chuckle, because it made me laugh, but it wasn't like amazing. I can't get it out of my head. America Again, Rebecoming the Greatness We Never Weren't. Make America Great Again. Oh god. The next challenge was to read a food memoir. I read Relish by Lucy Nicely specifically for this challenge, so it pushed me to read it for this challenge. This is my first Lucy Nicely. I think I ended up reading another book by hers this year, and I just picked up a third. In a word, I would describe this as adorable. The next challenge was to read a play, and I read Harry Potter and the Cursed Child by J.K. Rowling? The word that I chose for this one was bittersweet, because I enjoyed the characters and I enjoyed the story for the most part. But towards the end, I just didn't even care to continue reading it. It took me like more than a month to finish it. It does not deserve to be Harry Potter number 8. And the last challenge was to read a book with a main character that has mental illness. This is not necessarily a main character. It's her life, so it's a nonfiction book. But she does delve a lot into mental illness. That's basically the whole point of this book. The word that I picked for this book is kind, because I think she's very kind to herself and to her readers to be more understanding of themselves when it comes to their mental illness. It was the first book about mental illness I'd read, I don't know in how long. I need to read more. So that's pretty much it. I'm ready for 2017. I looked at the challenges, and some of them are pretty hard, especially they had authors pick some of them, and I was like, wow, some of these are hard. I hope you enjoyed learning about what I ended up reading for the Book Riot Read Harder Challenge, and I hope you're having a nice day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.